Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our third webinar for this year's Texas Academy for Marine Policy. I am Alyssa Schultz. I'm the graduate director and host for this program. So the aim of this webinar series is to build off of the foundation laid from last year's program, where we learned a lot about the local and federal government structure and processes, the role of science in policy as well as for policy, and how to communicate science in the policy sphere. So if you've missed any of those talks last year or our previous two talks this year, you can find those videos on the Texas Sea Grant YouTube channel. It's also embedded on the TAMP webpage. So this year's webinar series revolves around ocean governance, policy, and regulatory bodies. And today we have a really great speaker, Pradeep Singh, who will talk to us a bit about the International Seabed Authority, deep sea mining, and biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. If you have any questions or thoughts at all during the talk, please feel free to put them into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen or hang on to them at the very end. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes or maybe a bit more with our speaker following the talk. And so with that, let's meet our speaker. Pradeep Singh is a fellow at the Research Institute for Sustainability, Helmholtz-Centre Potsdam, formerly the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. He's the lead of the IUCN's Commission on Ecosystem Management's Thematic Group on Deep Seabed Mining and deputy chair of the Ocean Law Specialist Group of the World Commission on Environmental Law. Pradeep regularly attends and participates in the multilateral ocean negotiations, including the meetings of the International Seabed Authority, and advises several governments and actors on deep seabed mining, ocean governance, and marine biodiversity conservation in areas beyond national jurisdiction. His expertise is in public international law, the law of the sea, international environmental law, natural resource governance, and climate policy. Pradeep's academic qualifications include degrees from Harvard Law School, the University of Edinburgh, and the University of Malaya in his home country, Malaysia. So without further ado, Pradeep, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, evening to all of you there. It's 11 p.m. here, but very happy to be here. Let me just get my slides on. Trying to get it on slideshow. Right, so please let me know, Alyssa, if you can see the slides in there in full screen.
It looks great to me.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about deep sea mining and the International Seabed Authority, or ISA. Sort of going to be a crash course on, ocean governance, deep seabed mining 101. But of course, happy to go into discussion with any additional questions you may have. Before going into, deep seabed mining and the International Seabed Authority, I wanted to first sort of give you an understanding about, why the interest today. And it's actually, something not many people know about, but, we actually discovered these, deep sea minerals, and in this case, what is called polymetallic nodules. I'll explain this mineral deposit a little later. But these minerals were actually discovered 150 years ago, already in the 1860s, 1870s. But at that point in time, there was, no commercial interest in extracting them. And you can see, some of the early, drawings of how these minerals were actually extracted from the deep ocean in the voyage of the HMS Challenger. In the 1960s, that's when we really started to see increase in attention of, these mineral resources. There was a book published in 1965 called The Mineral Resources of the Sea. And in this publication, the author, John Merrow, basically painted a picture that the deep sea has a lot of potential mineral resources that are abundant, and it would be a great source of wealth. But at that point in time in the 1960s, to some extent even today, but at that point in time especially, only developed states actually had the technology or the financial strength to access these resources. So, there was this concern of, might is right, first come, first serve. And that actually led a lot of developing countries to sort of say that, this is something that we cannot accept, that developed states would be the ones that have the technology and the strength to access these resources, and they will access them and deplete these resources and gain wealth, again, at the expense of developing countries. So in 1967, so just very shortly after the publication of this book, the United Nations first committee actually convened a meeting to talk about it, and Arvid Pardo, the ambassador of Malta back then, basically gave a resounding speech, basically imploring states to declare that these mineral resources be designated as the common interests of mankind. And here's a quote from his speech back then. He said, the race to be the first to possess ocean floor resources should give way to an international authority to oversee the development of these shared resources, rather than, these developed countries actually going out on their own to exploit these resources. So towards the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s, the UN General Assembly, convened and passed a string of resolutions, among them, designating these resources as the common heritage of humankind, that needs to be administered through an international regime. But of course, there was nothing back then that the United Nations could rely on. And so a resolution was actually passed to commence negotiations on having a new comprehensive treaty for the law of the sea, not only to tackle deep seabed mining issues, but also to settle other, unresolved issues such as maritime boundaries and so on. So we had actually, from 1973 to 1982, almost a decade, multilateral negotiations that culminated in 1982 with the adoption of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which you would have heard by now. UNCLOS is actually, another sort of, term for UNCLOS is that it's the constitution for the ocean. So it essentially, provides how we use the marine space and the legal framework that applies, who has what rights, who has what obligations, and so on. And it's pretty comprehensive because it covers all the different maritime zones, as I'll come to next. But the convention did not enter into force at first. And very interestingly, one of the main obstacles why states were, sort of hesitant to ratify the convention is because of the part that deals with deep seabed mining. In fact, a lot of developed countries were not happy with the outcome of UNCLOS with respect to deep seabed mining. The reason why the convention was able to, create or design or establish a regime that was quite ambitious was because at this point in time, from the 1970s onwards, there were more developing countries that just gained independence. And so they had the amount or the necessary number of votes to basically adopt the treaty, but that doesn't mean that they have the numbers to allow it to enter into force, especially since a lot of the developed countries were basically not agreeable to be a party to the convention, which in a sense would defeat the purpose, especially in the case of deep seabed mining, because from the previous slides, we learned that it's essential for the developed countries to be in the regime, since they are the ones that had the technology and the financial might to actually access these resources. So getting the developed countries into the convention was thought to be very important. Also, it wasn't just the case that developed countries, declined to ratify the convention in the 1980s. Actually, in the mid to late 1980s, several of these developed countries, the US, Germany, or West Germany back then, France, Japan, and others, actually entered into a reciprocating agreement of their own, these 8 or 10 developed countries that basically acknowledge each other's right to access the international seabed and the mineral resources. And these countries were acknowledging each other's claims. So, gave rise to a very, nervous atmosphere at that point in time, because developing countries were very anxious at the possibility that these developed countries would access these resources anyway. And so what happened was that this actually necessitated further negotiations, or you could even call it compromises on the part of developing countries, that led to what is called the 1994 agreement. So negotiations took place from 1990 onwards, again under the auspices of the United Nations. After 4 years, they were able to agree on the 1994 agreement, which to a large extent actually diluted the ambition of the convention, and I'll give you some examples later on in the presentation of the sort of compromises that developing countries had to make in order to entice developed countries to be a part of the convention. I forgot to mention earlier that the convention UNCLOS is a unique convention as compared to other international conventions or treaties, where states can actually make reservations to basically say, okay, part A doesn't apply to us, but B and C does, and part D, applies to us with some modifications. The convention was negotiated and adopted as a package deal, which basically means that you had to accept it all or none at all. And so that basically led developed countries specifically to insist on the convention being modified in order then for them to join the convention, which they did after the 1994 agreement. And in that same year, the convention entered into force, having met the number of ratifications. And at this day, we have 168 state parties to the convention. We'll come to that later again. But before going into more detail about the convention and the legal regime for deep seabed mining, I think it's first important to deal with definitions. What is it? What is deep seabed mining, or DSM as an acronym? Essentially, we're talking about the exploration and then eventual exploitation of mineral deposits at depths greater than 200 meters. So basically deeper than 200 meters, the part of the ocean where light really does not reach. In the case of deep sea minerals, we are essentially talking about three resource types. We have polymetallic nodules. This was the mineral deposit that I was telling you earlier in the beginning, the deposit that was actually discovered 150 years ago. Polymetallic nodules are located at abyssal plains. The average depths of about 4,000 to 6,000 meters. Although, of course, they already exist from 2,000 meters onwards, but the average depth is about 4,000 to 6,000 meters. And the main metal content of the polymetallic nodules are nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese. Then you have the second resource type, polymetallic sulfides. These are located at hydrothermal vents, average depths about 1,400 to 3,700 meters, with metal content of copper, lead, zinc, gold, and silver, as well as other rare elements. And then you have cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts, which are typically found at seamounts, average depths of between 800 to 2,400 meters. And the content, or the metal content of these crusts are, as the name suggests, primarily cobalt. Environmental implications, of course, they would differ to some extent based on the mineral type. In the case of polymetallic nodules, this involves collecting them through basically a dredging sort of equipment. But in the case of sulfides and crusts, this would involve quite a large degree of cutting and just pulling them off. But what they share in common is that these resources, once retrieved from the ocean floor, they will be extracted up through a riser pipe. They will undergo some sort of processing, shipboard processing, just a very basic processing aboard the ship, where they would be separated from the water, and then the wastewater would then be released back through a return pipe back into the ocean. So again, you can sort of imagine the types of impacts that would happen is that At the extraction surface, that will be, a lot of damage in the immediate vicinity, the generation of sediment plumes that could spread for quite a distance. You would have, underwater noise, light, and vibration through the riser pipe as well, and once it's returned, vibration from that. But during the return, you would also have a lot of environmental implications from the discharge. Again, another round of sediment plumes will occur once the waste is discharged. So essentially, that would be the environmental implications of it, but also the engineering techniques at this point in time of how the minerals are intended to be extracted. In terms of distribution of these minerals, they can be found in, seabed areas within national jurisdiction, as well as seabed areas beyond national jurisdiction, what is legally called as the area under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. So I mentioned that I would come back to maritime zones because it's important for this presentation to sort of, identify, what would fall within national jurisdiction and what would fall beyond national jurisdiction. And the convention, one of the things that it does do, as mentioned, not just regulate, deep seabed mining activities and so on, but it also designates the maritime zones of the ocean and who has rights and responsibilities in those zones. Essentially, from the coastline or baseline, basically, up until 200 nautical miles, that is what is called the exclusive economic zone when we talk about the water column. And for the seabed as well, under the continental shelf regime, that extends up to 200 nautical miles of the coastal state. In some cases, the continental shelf can be extended beyond 200 nautical miles. So the water column cannot be extended. The exclusive economic zone always ends 200 nautical miles from the shoreline, but the continental shelf, in some cases, if certain requirements under the convention are fulfilled, these continental shelf of coastal states can be extended even up to 350 nautical miles. So in the case of the extended continental shelf, so this sort of distance from 200 nautical miles to up to 350 nautical miles, a coastal state would actually have, sovereign rights over the seabed, but not on the water column, because the water column after the exclusive economic zone would already be the high seas. Whereas the seabed, up until the extended continental shelf, coastal states would have the right to exploit resources of the continental shelf. But beyond this extended continental shelf is what is called the area, or the International Seabed Area. So just to, sort of like, make this more clear and to demonstrate, what is the area and what is the extended continental shelf, you can look at this chart that is, just popped up on your screens. You have the areas that are in blue, which are the exclusive economic zones of coastal states. And then you have this area in red, which is either existing claims to extend the continental shelf or already established extended continental shelf. That's the area in red. And so basically we're talking about the areas in white that would be the International Seabed Area. So when we speak about the high seas, so basically the water column and the surface of the ocean, it's about 70% of the world's ocean would be, what is called the high seas. But when we talk about the area, the International Seabed Area, it's somewhere around 55%. So, significantly less, simply because of this extended continental shelf that the convention or UNCLOS allows. So when we talk about the continental shelf or the extended continental shelf, sovereign rights, coastal states have sovereign rights to exploit resources here, which they can do, provided it's done in accordance with international law, as well as domestic environmental laws and policies. When it comes to the area, that is governed under Part 11 of the convention. These resources, the mineral resources of the international seabed, has been designated as the common heritage of humankind. They can only be accessed through the International Seabed Authority, and any sort of exploration or exploitation activities must be carried out for the benefit of humankind as a whole, and any revenues that are received must be shared through a mechanism for benefit sharing in an equitable manner. So just to sort of give you an indication now, coming back to the resource types that I mentioned in the previous slide, and in this sort of map here at the bottom of this slide, you would see where these resources are known to be located. So in the case of polymetallic nodules, that these areas that are in dark or navy blue, you would see a lot of them are primarily located on the international seabed as opposed to within national jurisdiction. In fact, the rough estimate is somewhere around 70 or 80% of polymetallic nodules are thought to be on the international seabed, with perhaps some 20 or 20+% being in areas within national jurisdiction. The Cook Islands, for example, is a good example of a coastal state that actually has abundant polymetallic nodules within its continental shelf. But by and large, most of the polymetallic nodules are thought to be on the international seabed area. In the case of polymetallic sulfides, which I mentioned earlier, are located through vents. You would see basically on this vent fields there, about 60% or so of polymetallic sulfides are thought to actually be within national jurisdiction, with about 40% to be on the international seabed area. And then you have cobalt-rich crusts, which are, perhaps the reverse, about 40% within national jurisdiction and about 60% on the international seabed. So by and large, quite a substantial amount of these resources are on the international seabed. And that is the focus of the presentation today. The convention, I mentioned that part 11 of the convention, UNCLOS, is the part that governs deep seabed mining in the international seabed area. Article 136 is an important provision. It basically designates the mineral resources of the area as the common heritage of humankind. Article 137 spells out what this actually means, that no state or any actor can actually claim or exercise any form of sovereignty or sovereign rights in this space and over the mineral resources. All rights in the resources are vested in humankind as a whole, on whose behalf the International Seabed Authority is entrusted to act. You also have other provisions. An important one is Article 140, which decrees that the exploration and exploitation activities must be carried out for the benefit of humankind as a whole, and whatever financial or other economic benefits that are derived from these activities must be distributed equitably through a mechanism that the International Seabed Authority designs. 141 says that the area shall be used for peaceful purposes. Another very, very important provision, which comes up quite often in the negotiations now, which I will come to again later, is Article 145, which imposes the obligation on the International Seabed Authority to take all necessary measures to ensure the effective protection of the marine environment from whatever harmful effects that occur as a result of deep seabed mining. Article 148 essentially confirms that the participation of developing states is important, and the International Seabed Authority shall take steps to promote the effective participation of these states. So with that fundamental principles in mind, let's go a little deeper into what is the International Seabed Authority. It is an autonomous international organization established under the convention. So it doesn't really come under the structure of the United Nations. It's independent and it's a standalone international organization that has been established by the convention and by the member states to the convention. It's headquartered in Kingston, Jamaica, and as provided under the convention, if you are a state party, if you have ratified the convention, you are automatically a member state to the International Seabed Authority. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are 168 states that are party to the convention and the EU as well. And so automatically all these state parties and the EU are, member states to the ISA. You look at and I should add that the US at the moment still has not ratified the convention and is accordingly not a member state to the ISA. Now, if you look at the chart on the right, this essentially sort of, provides the organizational structure of the ISA. We have the two primary organs, which are essentially the political organs of the ISA. You have the Assembly and the Council. I'll come back to that later. But you also have the Secretariat, which is the administrative arm of the ISA that is in charge for the day-to-day administration of the authority. You also have what is an organ known as the enterprise. And this is a very interesting organ of the ISA. As you can see, it's not yet operationalized. This was essentially, one of the examples that I mentioned that I would come back to of the 1994 agreement that developing states actually had to compromise in order to entice developed states to be a part of the convention. Now, the enterprise was envisioned to be the mining arm of the authority. In fact, in the 1970s, developing states, came up with the proposal of having an international mining arm to do all deep seabed mining activities on the international seabed area, as opposed to giving out contracts to countries or to private actors. So basically, developing countries said that, why don't we all channel our resources into one combined mining arm, and we just do deep seabed mining for the benefit of humankind, as opposed to giving out individual contracts. Developed states did not like this idea at all, because as I mentioned earlier, they had the technology, or they thought they had the technology back then to extract these resources in an economically viable way. And they didn't want to share this technology, and neither did they want to actually provide the resources to what they saw as a competition to them. And so as a result, the 1994 agreement postponed the operationalization of the enterprise until such point in time in the future where the ISA has generated enough revenue to be able to operationalize the enterprise on its own, and the enterprise is able to buy its own technology and so on. And so that is one of the reasons why even until today, the enterprise is not yet in operation. I'll come back now to the two primary organs, or the two political organs, the Assembly and the Council. So the Assembly is basically the plenary organ of the ISA. You have all 168 member states that have a seat in the Assembly, and each of them have the right to vote. In practice, though, Assembly meetings are poorly attended, so you have usually somewhere just about 60 to 70 states that attend ISA meetings, so barely even half. And in fact, more often than not, there's no quorum for the meetings to take place. But the Assembly, even though it's the organ where all states are, have a seat, and they are there, they all each have one vote. It's not really the organ in which key decisions are taken. Key decisions, including executive decisions, are taken by the Council, which is an organ comprising 36 states only. Now, the Assembly elects these states into the Council for cycles of 4 years, but they are structured in such a way that most powerful countries are always assured a seat on the Council. So it's quite similar to the UN Security Council, if you're familiar with how that works. But in this case, the interest groups that are protected are the major consumers of the commodities that would come from deep seabed mining, the major investors in deep seabed mining, so countries that are major investors, as well as a few other areas that are thought to be of interest of worth protecting. So in that sense, countries like China, Russia, Germany, France, and others are almost virtually certain to get a seat on the council. The US, once it becomes, if it decides to ratify the convention and thereby become a state party to the ISA, it is also guaranteed a seat on the council. There are also some subsidiary bodies to both the assembly and the council. And I'll just, talk a little bit about the one advisory body or technical body to the council, which is the Legal and Technical Commission, the LTC. And this body actually has quite a lot of responsibilities. It's essentially there to, provide recommendations to the council on just about anything that the council is obligated to do under the convention. And this includes, deciding on whether or not an application for a mining contract is to be approved. And so in the case of deciding whether or not to approve a mining application, the decision lies with the council, not with the assembly. So, approving a mining contract is not something that all states actually have a say, but just the 36 states. And the 36 states is, to a very large extent, guided by the evaluation and recommendation given by the Legal and Technical Commission, in a sense that if the Legal and Technical Commission recommends to the council to approve an application, it's actually quite difficult for the council to, reverse that recommendation. So in that sense, the convention, is already pre-built towards inclining to allow mining activities to commence. I'll give you some examples later on as well on how important and influential the Legal and Technical Commission is in the ISA setup. But first, sort of like, to give you more of a bit of flavor in terms of the multiple responsibilities of the International Seabed Authority, its mandate, basically in representing humankind as a whole. Again, Article 145 comes up, adopting necessary measures for the effective protection of the environment. Article 153 comes up, developing a system for exploration and exploitation, which basically means to adopt relevant rules, regulations, and procedures, enhance participation of developing countries, financial terms that would apply to mining contracts, and collecting payments from contractors. A very interesting responsibility of the ISA is to develop a system to compensate developing countries whose economies are, reliant on land-based mining. So essentially, again, deep seabed mining is also seen as a competition to terrestrial mining activities, and developing countries who are, large land-based mining countries are thought to, that if deep seabed mining commences and if it takes place at a significant enough rate, that developing countries who do land-based mining would suffer losses. And the ISA is basically responsible to develop a system of compensation to these countries that has basically lost income from terrestrial mining because of deep seabed mining. Article 142, essentially, as I mentioned earlier, requires the ISA to administer an appropriate mechanism for the equitable sharing of benefits, the consideration and approval of applications that are submitted for exploration and in future exploitation activities, to conduct inspection to secure compliance, and to generally exercise control over exploration and exploitation activities, and as well as to promote the conduct of marine scientific research and to promote capacity development and the transfer of technology. So a lot of responsibilities on the part of the ISA, and in some cases also, as you can see, somewhat conflicting and contradictory responsibilities. Now, who can apply to the ISA for a mining contract? So any one of the following can actually submit an application to the ISA, any member state of the convention. So again, In this case, the US is not able to submit an application, but other member states can submit applications, and you do have governments that have submitted applications and are and do have existing contracts with the ISA as a state. So some examples are India and Korea, for example, but I'll come back to that later. The enterprise can submit an application. Of course, it would first need to enter into operation. As I mentioned earlier, that is not the case at the moment. And a third category, which is a very interesting category, and it's the by far the largest amount of applications that have been received and approved for exploration. And this category is state-owned enterprises and private actors, basically mining companies, provided they have the sponsorship of an eligible member state or states. And so this is where it's interesting because the convention imagined the situation that there would be, non-state actors. So basically non-states that would want to apply for mining contracts. But since they do not have they're not subjects of international law and they don't have that international law persona, the negotiators back then thought of a way out of this, saying that, of course, you can have non-state actors, you can have private actors apply for a contract with the ISA, but they must have the backing of an eligible state, a state that essentially agrees to take on responsibility under international law on behalf of this private person. In terms of sponsorship, states can sponsor their own nationals, and they can also sponsor foreign nationals, provided they are under their effective control or under the effective control of their nationals. Now, this gives rise to, what is this requirement of effective control? And it's something that is quite divisive at the moment, and it's still undergoing debate. Essentially, a member state is presumed to have effective control over its own nationals. However, if the circumstances are such that another state or its national happens to exercise effective control, then that other state must also be a sponsoring state. And there was a decision by the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea in 2011, when it gave an advisory opinion, sort of explaining why we have this, sponsorship requirement and why is effective control important. And it says essentially, and I'm quoting from the decision itself, that equality of treatment between developing and developed sponsoring states is consistent with the need to prevent commercial enterprises from developed states from just simply setting up companies in developing states and by reason thereof acquiring their nationality and then being able to get their sponsorship in the hope of being subjected to less burdensome regulations and control. And so essentially the tribunal back then, said that if we have this sort of proliferation of what is called sponsoring states of convenience, this would jeopardize the whole regime, the need for the highest standards of protection of the marine environment, as well as to protect the common heritage of humankind. This is something, under debate because, as I've mentioned, the US, for example, is not a party to the convention, but a US company, Lockheed Martin, for example, until recently actually held 2 contracts with the ISA because of the fact that it had a subsidiary company that was formed in the UK and thereby managed to get sponsorship from the UK to get these 2 contracts. Another very interesting case study, which we will come through later, and you may have heard of, is the Metals Company. And they're a company that is headquartered in Vancouver, Canada. It's trading on the NASDAQ in the US, but they've managed to get sponsorship from the Republic of Nauru in quite controversial fashion, and we'll come to this later. But the debate right now is quite strong, and quite a few states are saying that maybe we are, or we've actually, allowed this proliferation, even though the 2011 advisory opinion cautioned us against it, of this proliferation of sponsoring states of convenience. What are the current state of affairs at the International Seabed Authority? So again, ISA came into existence in 1994, so it will be turning 30 next year. Exploration activities have been going on, so a total of 30 contracts have been awarded, predominantly for nodules. So you have 19 of these 30 contracts for the exploration of polymetallic nodules. You have 7 for sulfides and 4 for crust. And the chart or the map on the right essentially shows us where these countries, where these contracts, sorry, are located and who are the countries that are sponsoring them. Very large amount of the contracts are at the very left in this area called the Clarion-Clipperton zone, where you can see that was in yellow, and you have all these numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's essentially, if you look at the legend at the bottom, these are the countries that are sponsoring these applications. This area in the Clarion-Clipperton zone is for polymetallic nodules, because it's known to be, the area of the ocean with the highest density of polymetallic nodules. And that is why 17 out of the 19 contracts for nodules is located in this very dense area of the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is sort of between Hawaii and Mexico. And then you have the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which are contracts for sulfides. And these contracts are sponsored by Poland, France, and Russia. Again, if you look at the Indian Ocean, the southern Indian Ocean off the coast of East Africa, you have, again, a chunk of the remaining 4 contracts for sulfides exploration held by South Korea, India, Germany, and China. And in this case, South Korea and India are holding these contracts as governments, as member states. You would also see next to South Korea there a block of nodules there in yellow, and that is actually held by the government of India. And then if you go to the very right, that's the Western Pacific Ocean. And here you have a chunk of the contracts for seamounts, for cobalt-rich ferromanganese crust. So this is the Western Pacific Ocean seamount area, where you have contracts sponsored by Russia, Japan, and China. And you also have 1 contract for polymetallic nodules there, held by or sponsored by China. So, apart from the one that India has in the Southern Indian Ocean, this one that is sponsored by China is the only 2. These are the only 2 contracts for the exploration of nodules outside that nodule dense area of the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So that's essentially where things stand with exploration activities. Exploitation. Now, we don't have any exploitation activities as of yet. Negotiations on the regulations are currently ongoing. It's happening at the council. There's this 2-year rule invocation that was done by Nauru in mid-2021. So essentially what this did was that it prescribed a deadline on the council to adopt regulations by 2 years from the point in time that the notice was given. It was given by Nauru in mid-2021. That deadline actually expired a few months ago on the 9th of July. The regulations were not adopted by then. Now, what this means is that, any application can be submitted now, despite the fact that the regulations are not absent. And this is quite a worrying situation, because it could lead to what some scholars, such as myself, have called, unregulated mining. So the convention does not anticipate any form of exploration or exploitation activities in the absence of regulations. In fact, the regulations must be adopted by consensus at the council. So it means that as long as all 36 states do not object to it, it can be adopted. But if just one state objects to it, then the regulations cannot be adopted. So really a lot of power dynamics here. Once it's adopted by the council, then it still needs to be approved by the assembly. And that is just, a 2/3 majority is required. So you don't need full consensus of all states, but just a 2/3 majority. But this again reflects the power balance of, the council being the more sort of important organ, and it's just the 36 states that actually make these, critical decisions. So the deadline expired on the 9th of July. Again, what this means is that for as long as, after the 9th of July, for as long as the regulations remain incomplete and, not finalized and adopted, and in this period of time, if an application is submitted, the council will still nevertheless have to to consider the application, and it can decide to approve the application, notwithstanding the fact that the regulations remain absent. And so, this is some of my work that I've published on the right here, and presentations that I've given to states at the ISA on my interpretations and arguments on this 2-year rule, and why the council needs to avoid this situation of unregulated mining. And fortunately, 2 decisions were taken by the council actually in July this year. Number one, that commercial mining should not commence in the absence of regulations. And they also came up with what is called an intended or an aspirational timeline to continue the negotiations with a view to adopt them in 2025. Although from the last meeting that just took place a few weeks ago, this is seeming to be very unlikely. Meanwhile, if you can look at the bottom, the one company sponsored by Nauru that is, really pushing to get mining started, they've already, right after the July meeting in early August, we made a press release saying that they intend to apply for a contract in 2024. So quite interesting, before even this, timeline that the council has sort of committed to. So negotiations are moving along, especially after this invocation of the 2-year rule, but calls for a precautionary pause or even a moratorium is also growing, with more and more states calling for a moratorium. As you can see, sort of like, in the bottom center, we have now about 23 to 24 countries that are calling for a pause or a moratorium on deep seabed mining, with the United Kingdom being the last one to announce their opposition to deep seabed mining by supporting a moratorium just 3 or 4 weeks ago. But you also have a lot of businesses such as Google, Volvo, Samsung, a lot of other car makers like Renault and so on, that are also calling for a moratorium, or have also committed to not source for their in their supply chain, to not source for minerals coming from the deep seabed, as well as a lot of scientists and marine experts that are also cautioning against deep seabed mining at this point in time. So I'm about to end very soon, but just to sort of highlight where things are at the moment, the council, as I said, met a couple of weeks ago. Negotiations were progressing through working groups. There are 5 groups, one on the financial aspects, one on institutional matters, one on environmental aspects, another one on inspection, compliance, and enforcement, and then everything else is discussed under what is called the precedence text. And you can see on the right how these regulations are divided into which working group. At the moment, states and observers are given until the 10th of December to submit further written textual proposals, which would then be brought up again at the next session, where we would have a consolidated text for negotiations. And the next meetings will be in March and July next year at the council. But there are still many other unresolved issues, not just the regulations, but also beyond the regulations. So the regulations are negotiated separately, for example, from the system of compensation to land-based developing countries, terrestrial mining countries. The benefit sharing mechanism, for instance, has not been discussed yet. And, more and more countries are saying, we cannot just agree on the regulations, we also need to, agree on these other aspects. There are also linkages to other, contemporary international processes. We have what is called the BBNJ agreement, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or the High Seas Treaty that was adopted earlier this year. There's also the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So just very quickly, we have this new BBNJ agreement that was adopted in June this year. and open for signature in September. And we have now 80 plus countries that have signed this BBNJ agreement. And it does say that, especially in Article 6, if you look at, this paragraph that, state parties shall promote the sustainable use and conservation of marine biodiversity, and they would need to promote the objectives of the BBNJ agreement in other legal instrument frameworks and other sort of global regional and sectoral bodies. And you have countries like France and Vanuatu that have argued that deep seabed mining at the ISA at this point in time could be incompatible with what we want to achieve, for example, under the BBNJ agreement. Then you have the global biodiversity framework that has recently been adopted under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And you have the SDG processes such as SDG 14. And coming back again to the global biodiversity framework, where what is called the 30 by 30 target has been sort of adopted, which essentially means protecting 30% of all ecosystems, including 30% of marine ecosystems by 2030, which was adopted as part of this Kunming-Montreal GBF, Global Biodiversity Framework. And this also applies to areas beyond national jurisdiction. And you had, for example, in the last few meetings of the ISA, countries like Belgium proposing that deep seabed mining should not start at the ISA until 30% of the international seabed area has been, undergone protection. At the same time, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the conference of the parties of the convention at that same meeting in December last year, also took a decision basically encouraging parties and inviting governments to ensure that before deep seabed mining happens, that we first understand the impacts on the marine environment, the biodiversity, that we assure that the technology and the operational practices do not cause harmful effects, and that rules, regulations, and procedures are in place by the International Seabed Authority. So to avoid this, scenario of the possibility of unregulated mining happening. So essentially, basically calling for a moratorium. So quite interesting development. I wanted to conclude on sort of many controversies of deep seabed mining, environmental issues, economic issues, equity issues, regulatory and institutional issues, as well as narrative issues. But maybe we can sort of tackle that in Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pradeep, for such a great talk on such a fascinating topic. The Q&A box is open for anyone that would like to ask questions, and Shelby has a question. Do you have any sense for how revenue sharing will work?
We do have an inkling. There are, several proposals out there. I think the worrying thing is that, we haven't started any form of negotiations on the options that are out there. The proposals that are on the table have essentially been made, for instance, by the Finance Committee. So one of the subsidiary bodies that, if you remember from the chart that I showed earlier, a technical advisory body, and they've sort of prepared a report of suggesting the options that there are. Of course, the one option is basically to just get the revenues in and then sort of, develop a system to, release the money or disperse the money to member states. And basically also taking into account things like GDP and so on. But that has sort of led some states to basically conclude that, look, we would get such small amounts from deep seabed mining, something like 50 to 100,000 US dollars per year. And that doesn't make any sense to allow mining activities to commence, particularly if you take into account the environmental harm and whatnot that happens. And so the Finance Committee has sort of came up with several other suggestions. One suggestion would be to come up with a sovereign welfare fund. Another suggestion would be to come up with a fund specifically for developing countries that could be used for public goods. So, for example, instead of distributing the money, maybe they could be used for vaccinations like COVID vaccines and whatever needed in the future. Other states are not happy with this proposal, so it remains something that is basically at the stage of infancy, and a lot of debate is needed on this topic. And you have countries like Brazil, for example, that is one of the examples that I gave earlier, that it's not just about the regulations and negotiating the regulations and then adopting them, and that's it, the job is done. And they're saying, look, we also need to agree on this system of compensation for terrestrial mining countries, because that money would have to be taken out from this pot before that, whatever that is left in the pot can be shared. And you have states that are basically saying that what if this system of compensation is basically going to take up all the money from this pot, and we don't want a situation then that we see very little money, right? And so basically countries like Brazil and Chile have said that we don't want to just agree on the regulations, we want to agree on the system of compensation. We also want to agree on then what we do with the rest of the money before we agree on the regulations, because we don't want a situation that we agree on the regulations and mining applications can come in and be approved, and then we are stuck with agreeing on this benefit sharing or compensation thing, and we are not able to achieve agreement on that where we are all happy with something. So again, a lot of work to be done, and worryingly, we haven't really had this debate yet, both at the council and at the assembly.
Great. What ways can we get involved in the deep sea mining conversation as graduate students, as researchers, as academics, etc.?
Yeah, there are many ways to participate. There is the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, which is a network of deep sea scientists. I'm even a part of this network. And through DOSI, the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, scientists and researchers are able to engage in the process. They even send a delegation of between 5 to 10 researchers and scientists for each meeting to the ISA, and then all expenses are covered. So I would really encourage getting in touch with and joining the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, as well as to sort of bring your publications to the light and to bring it to delegates through that process. The path that I've taken is through the IUCN, and you mentioned when you introduced me that I'm part of 2 IUCN commissions, so basically expert commissions, and through the IUCN commissions, I've been advising IUCN and the member states of IUCN, and I attend as part of the IUCN delegation to the ISA meetings. But again, there are also other ways that if you sort of feel that you belong to civil society, then there are civil society groups such as the Environmental Justice Foundation or the Sustainable Ocean Alliance that are also observers, accredited observers to the ISA. And you can then attend ISA meetings, present your research, make interventions on the floor, and so on. And we've seen now an increase of youth groups as well as indigenous groups that have been applying to the ISA to get accredited and to attend meetings. And so if you identify with those groups as youth groups or indigenous groups, then there are also means to get involved through these processes.
Great. And we have one more question from Shelby, and I think that's all we'll have time for. But she's asking, how adaptable do you think the mining code will be once it is made? And followed by research on all the various environmental impacts will lag behind the license approvals. So as more is known about the impact of DSM, will thresholds, et cetera, be able to be amended fairly easily?
Now that's a really good question. And that is also why the process is quite intricate. We are discussing the regulations, but the regulations in all essence would be implemented through standards and guidelines, which have been anticipated to some extent under the regulations, but it's also expected that future standards and guidelines will be developed. And these standards and guidelines are thought to be flexible, fluid. They are able to be amended and revised from time to time. There is a process that all standards would have to undergo periodic review, and there should be, well, at least on paper, a solid scientific process in order to first develop these standards and guidelines, and then in future to revise them and to keep them up to date. There's also now what is known as an intersessional group on the development of thresholds, environmental thresholds. And for this point in time, they've started off with 3 thresholds. So one on sedimentation, one on, toxicity, and another one on underwater noise. And there's, groups of, I think, 10 plus experts in each of this thresholds working group that have now started to work on developing thresholds. And it's expected that the same process will, take place periodically in order to ensure that these standards and guidelines are kept up to date. But again, the process is a political one. So what actually ends up making it into the standard guidelines, and in the future iterations of revisions, that would undergo the same political process. Although, of course, if the science is overwhelming, then there are very valid reasons to ensure that these are kept up to date. But the process is ultimately a political one.
Great. Okay, we did get one more question. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. From Andrew, do we have any analogs to the proposed enterprise organ of the ISA, other international bodies that control the collection / extraction of natural resources? Followed by, this is a really interesting way to try and ensure that benefits from DSM are shared between member states.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. That's also something that we've been looking into. You don't really see any parallels of it. There was a proposal to have something similar for outer space, but that was, basically, killed off by countries like the US about 40 years ago, I think, to have this sort of like a just one international space arm, which back then US and the Soviet Union could not accept. They were, of course, thinking about developing the same concept of common heritage that would apply to the moon and other planets and so on. But that's not been the case. I think we do have some collaboration with outer space, such as the ISS, but not more than that. No real parallels to the enterprise. But the good news now, I think, is that the African countries in particular have sort of, revived the discussion on the enterprise. And they've essentially said, not in these words, but they've essentially said that we would probably not be in a position to adopt the regulations until the enterprise comes into operation. So essentially, they're sort of saying that we want to see the enterprise in operation before we are ready to sign off on the regulations. And if the enterprise is not operationalized by then we would, be more than willing to object to the adoption of the regulation. So, because essentially that's the way that they've sort of seen or see that they can participate and benefit from seabed mining activities directly, as opposed to not having the financial means and the technology to engage in these activities. And so they're taking it as their cause now to have the enterprise coming into operation. And in fact, a few countries have also sort of reached out to me and other consultants, sort of saying, is there a way that we can actually we've really come so far in 30 years, but still, is there any way we can revert back to the original idea that developing countries put forward in the 1970s? Can we just have one mining arm? Why are we, giving out contracts to individual states and private actors? That doesn't make any sense. We should all be working together, if at all we want to do this for the benefit of humankind. So let's see. Yeah, that will be quite an interesting development if things go in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you. that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Pradeep, for being here so late at your time. And thank you all for joining us today. We've got several comments in here saying how informative this talk has been and how much we've all learned. So thank you. Our next webinar will be next week, Tuesday, November 28th, same place, same time. We will have Carrie Schmaus from the Department of Energy talking about the role of the Department of Energy in supporting marine energy and how they collaborate with other federal agencies and communities. So I hope I will see you all there.
Thank you very much. I'll pass you the slides and you can share it with the group. And if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out. Have a good day. Happy Thanksgiving.
You too.